Hello, you're very welcome to this tutorial on iris recognition, automated biometric recognition using the iris. And what we will be doing is looking at the iris as a biometric system, how the image pattern of the iris can be extracted and processed and used to identify or verify an individual, and in particular why it's so powerful as a biometric, why it's so considered so strong, and why it's so desirable to have a biometric system. How these particular things work, how the actual anatomy of the iris contributes to that efficiency. So more specifically, we want to take a look at speed and accuracy of the iris and the quality of the image that can be actually extracted right there from your eye, and indicate why its use is so powerful within applications and in terms of identifying somebody through a biometric. Now, I suppose firstly it has to be said that the iris is increasing in popularity all the time as a biometric. We're seeing it more and more used. This pattern can be extracted much more readily than ever before in terms of acquiring the image. But once that image has been acquired, it's very sort of it's very unique. It's almost impossible to have two people with the same iris pattern once that image has been actually acquired. So we'll see this in the likes of airport systems. Here's a system we can see right here where someone's iris is being acquired even at a distance. Clock-in systems and anywhere really where someone needs to be authenticated or verified. And obviously in the movies it's been very popular for quite a long time. Of course, we all know the scene from the movie Minority Report with a certain Mr. Cruz who attempts to circumvent or hack into an iris recognition system. Now, just taking a look at the eye itself, there's actually three biometrics within the eye. There's the retina at the back of the eye. You can see the light entering from the front, and there's also this sort of red vein pattern, the conjunctival vasculature. Probably easier to see this if you've had a bit of a late night, but that's actually a biometric of the eye as well. But of course it's the iris itself, this pattern that is still the desired biometric, and accessing that little pattern, you can even see it in this image here, is the key to using this and enrolling somebody in a very unique way. Now, in terms of the iris there as a biometric, what exactly is it about the iris that makes it so powerful, and how can this pattern be extracted in an efficient manner? Well, the first thing that has to be said is that it's relatively accessible. I mean, it's right there. It's right there for all to see. If you look into anyone's eyes, you can see their iris pattern yourself. Maybe don't get too close, but even without using any equipment, you can see someone's iris pattern to some extent. Now, in terms of the 7 characteristics of biometrics, the iris does really well. It's right up there in almost every one of these 7 characteristics. Now, in terms of its being universality, everyone's got an iris, got eyes. Most people will have eyes. Compare that to, for example, the fingerprints, the voice, which is not the same level of universality. It's distinctive, it's highly, highly unique. This pattern is so rich, it's highly unlikely anybody will have 2 irises the same. Even identical twins will not have the same iris pattern. Compare that to the face, for example, which is very low in distinctiveness. Now, permanence. Over one's lifetime, a healthy iris does not deteriorate, does not change. The pattern does not change very much at all. It's considered pretty much permanent throughout one's life. Let's skip here just to performance. That also gets high because the iris data, while very rich and very unique in its pattern, it's actually quite a simple pattern to process. It's not a particularly complex pattern to process computationally, and it can be run quickly. It can be, an iris authentication can be done in real time. It can be done very quickly and very efficiently because of the way that the image is, the way the image can be enhanced and processed. Now, you compare that, for example, to the face, which is a very complicated image. It's a very slow, time-consuming thing to process. The iris is just so much higher than that. Circumvention, it's not really possible at the moment to hack into a system trying to pretend you have somebody else's iris, or to make a fake iris. One of the reasons being because it's a live organ. It's continuously moving based on the light conditions. It dilates and constricts all the time. Now, just in terms of acceptability and collectability, a word has to be said here that this is now changing. It was always traditionally not that easy to collect someone's iris. It wasn't acceptable in airports for people to use the type of devices that they had to stick their heads right up to in order to obtain their iris. But that's all changing right now, because the systems that we're seeing can acquire someone's iris at a distance, turning this medium collectability and low acceptability into high collectability and high acceptability, because people won't even realize their iris is being acquired, which will make the iris across the board really the gold standard of biometrics compared to any of the other biometrics. We have here fingerprints and face. In any of these characteristics, the iris really is top dog in that domain. So a quick look at the anatomy of the eye. Here's the front of the eye peeled back. You can see the iris itself there. Its function is really to regulate light in through the pupil. It's a multi-layered structure, and up close, it's actually not that pretty as you might think. Here's a little section of the cornea. There's a glassy structure that covers the eye. And when you see the iris up close, you'll see it's a coarse, diverse pattern. It has a high texture, very much a multi-layered structure. And the pattern that we're looking for is this zigzag-like pattern that's just around the pupil. So it's very small in relation to the rest of the iris. Now, the anatomy of the eye. Here's a cross-section of the eye, which we want to just show to illuminate what the iris does as its function. Well, in terms of the actual lens, which is right behind the iris, light will enter the lens via the pupil, and the iris regulates this entry. It basically constricts or dilates depending on that light levels in order to regulate that light entering the lens. So it's kind of like a camera aperture. Anyone who's dabbled in photography will have seen this. If you take a picture in low light conditions, you need to have a fairly large aperture. Of course, the iris is like an aperture, but it's on the eye. So large aperture in photography for low light conditions. And on the eye, the iris will basically constrict in high light conditions, and it will dilate in low light conditions. So here it is. Here's a dilated pupil and a constricted pupil. And what this does, this constant movement gives us an enormous advantage in terms of liveness detection. Because if you're going to try to circumvent the iris using some fake iris, well, your fake iris will have to move. It will have to dilate and constrict according to the light conditions that it encounters. So we look at that again at a micro level in a moment. But that's a huge advantage to the iris, which is one of the reasons it's right up there as the gold standard of biometric. Looking at the anatomy of the actual iris itself, well, there's several areas of it we want to look at. One area here is the pupillary boundary, just around the pupil zone itself. You can see there's a zigzag-like pattern just there, right there, just beside the pupil. The collarate is this area here. It's not quite circular, as we'll see in the next slide. But between the pupil and the collarate, there is a zigzag-like structure, and that contains a pattern that is extremely rich in data. Like in the other photograph, it's a texture-based pattern. It's got high relief. It's got valleys and troughs. Pretty much, it's unique in every individual. You've got the limbus boundary out here, which is where the iris ends, meets the sclera, the white part of the eye, and the pupillary zone, obviously, is where the pattern we're looking for is. The contraction furrows, have a look at these kind of concentric circles that you see going all the way around the iris in various concentric levels. What these are folds. As the iris dilates, the material of the iris has to go somewhere. And it folds in on itself as it constricts and dilates, and that movement can be easily picked up from an infrared camera to basically ensure liveness detection. So as you present for authentication, your iris will be dilating all the time, and those contraction furrows will be deepening as it folds in on itself. Here's crypt, these structures that we point out here. Well, they basically are areas that fill up with fluid as the iris dilates and contracts. Up close, here's the pupillary zone again. Now you can see there's the collarate. The collarate is not exactly a circular pattern, but it surrounds the pupillary zone. This is the zigzag pattern that we spoke of. Here's a crypt just outside the pupillary zone, and that zigzag pattern there, which is the hugely diverse and hugely detailed information about a person's identification. It's just that will ID a person, and no two are going to be the same, even in twins, for example. And that's what we're after. So how can that pattern be acquired? What type of imaging technique do you need to get that pattern? And once you've taken an image of it, to show all the information, what do you do with it to enroll someone on a database? So here is that diverse, rich texture pattern around the pupillary zone again. It's coarse, it's very unique, even in twins. And another thing that it does is that the iris is moving. So just a point about the iris movement that has to be said. It's continuously reacting to the light, and on this image it's much easier, for example, to see the contraction furrows, it folds as it folds in on itself, and also these things called radial furrows. So as it dilates, the folds, the radial furrows, those are these horizontal lines that deepen as it folds in on itself, and the concentric circles are the contraction furrows. So what that's going to do is it's going to immediately show that the iris is live, it's reacting, which makes it impossible to circumvent. One word about color. A lot of people talk about identifying somebody by the color of their eyes. They say things like, there's the person with the very striking blue eyes. With regard to the iris as a biometric, that's not the case. Color is just the amount of pigmentation you have in your eye, how many melanin granules you have. The more you have, the closer to brown your eyes will look. And in terms of the biometric, it's got no effect. It plays very little role in identifying somebody. It's really the texture detail that we're looking for. So in order to do that, to get that texture detail like we've seen in the previous photographs, we need to use an infrared camera. And that's why the images you see in iris recognition systems will be these grayscale images that are being used with an infrared camera, because they show up the data so much more readily. There's a few stages, of course, to get this. You've got to acquire the image, and then there's a segmentation stage, and that's where you find the pupil zone and the outer limbus boundary. And then there's another stage called normalization, where you basically sort of unwrap the iris. It's like cutting the image right down there and unwrapping it out, flattening it out into a straight two-dimensional image. That's going to be processed further. It's going to be binarized into a monochromatic image and then finally encoded. But it all begins by using this near-infrared camera. So color plays very little role in iris recognition. It's all about processing a monochromatic image using an near-infrared camera. It's got several stages, of course, to do this. You know, from acquiring the image, reducing the working area down to just that iris section, you know, disregarding everything else, transforming the pupil so it's looking straight on into the camera. If the head was tilted slightly, that image has to be slightly transformed to just be straight on. But once that's done, the image can actually be extracted fairly easily. So if you take this image here, like I'm pointing to, and just sort of strip it out, literally cut that image out, that will contain all the iris information you need to identify somebody. It's normalized in that it's changed into a two-dimensional rectangular shape. It's stretched ever so slightly to account for the dilation, the variations in dilation as you might have presented, and the variations in iris size between the population. And it's enhanced finally to such a point that it's a monochromatic, two-dimensional, rectangular pattern that is unique to every individual. Here's the major enrollment stages, and you can see that the enhancement stage is just as important as the normalization stage, because once that image, that normalized image of the iris has been enhanced to such a point that the features can be extracted readily, At that point, you can enroll someone to the database. It's their iris code, remember, that's enrolled, not their image. And at authentication, a similar process will identify somebody. Now, acquisition, just to hammer the point that it's infrared light used because it emanates heat. This is a way of giving a more detailed image than you would otherwise get with visible light. A two-dimensional image, monochromatic, camera sensitive to near infrared light is used. An external, I should say, source of near infrared light is often used, often co-located with the acquisition system. You can see the subject here is lining her iris up to a mirror, and at this little section here, an infrared light source would be beamed into her eye to illuminate the iris in order to take that image a little bit easier, in order to get that image detail out. Now, segmentation is a very important stage, but really it's this normalization process where once segmented, you can strip out that iris image and make a rectangular shaped image. It transforms basically what was a circular iris texture into a set of Cartesian coordinates, a two-dimensional image via the rubber sheet model, effectively unwrapping the iris so that the rows correspond to angular direction, columns at radial direction. It gives you the shape of the iris as a two-dimensional pattern that can be used to identify somebody. It's not just about turning a circular pattern into a rectangular pattern. It also accounts for variations in pupil size among everybody. People will have different sizes of pupils anyway. And the variations of dilations to your pupils as you present for enrollment, maybe a slightly different stage of dilation as you show up for authentication. So the normalization sort of stretches that out and irons and ensures that there's a standardized size that this rectangular pattern to show the iris's unique information, this rectangular pattern that we showed, that it's standardized in size for everybody depending on the size of their iris naturally and the level of dilation at the particular enrollment or the authentication. So it creates a common mapping, and also particularly if your irises were slightly tilted, it takes care of that as well. So a normalization process will unwrap the iris into a rectangular image rather than a circular one. It will be stretched to account for dilation, what level of dilation your eyes were at when you were at the authentication point, and also the variations in size among individuals. So when you come to the encoding and matching, it will be a standardized shape. So this matching shape has already been processed into monochromatic light. You can see, sorry, a monochromatic image. You can see it's binarized. It's just black pixels on a white background. It's been normalized. This is only a subsection of the entire iris data, of an entire iris data. And as you can see, it's highly detailed. So once it's been extracted and normalized, that information is highly detailed. It contains so much information, so much more information than even the largest type of password that you could ever use. And it's right there located on your eye. This is effectively a two-dimensional iris code. And that's the features that is sought after in order to authenticate you. It's compared using a Hamming distance to just bit-by-bit comparison to what the same features that were enrolled in the database in the first place. So every time you show up for an authentication, it just uses a Hamming distance to compare how similar you are to your enrollment data, and it will accept your authentication and verify you to log in or pass through an airport system or whatever that may be. So hardware. A word about hardware, because this is changing all the time. In particular, recently, we're seeing much less of these type of binocular-like systems where you've got to put a whole device right up to your eyes in order to take your iris. It's frankly got very low acceptability for most people. It's very difficult to collect things that way. We're seeing more of these systems where you can take someone's irises at quite a distance, an even bigger distance than what you see here. Now, obviously the iris has some problems. It has to be stable. You've got to have the iris in order to acquire an image. It's so small, any movement will just destroy the image. So the subject eye must be stable and in pretty close proximity to the camera. So traditionally you've seen devices that had to get very close to the eye in order to do this, but now so much research and investment has gone into systems where you can take an image of an iris at a considerable distance, just like almost taking a photograph of somebody. So, you know, we're literally seeing a reality now where you've got iris at a distance systems. So rather than having to stick a device close to your face, the actual eyes can be detected first, just like what your camera might do at a distance. The face can be detected, and then within the face, the eyes are detected through some sort of maybe an edge detection system. This is very quick and very easy to do. And once the iris has been detected, an infrared image can be obtained using this type of technology in order to segment it and process it to get those features, that feature pattern extracted from it. Now, those are irises on at a distance. Iris recognition at a distance and irises on the move, and particularly on the move, that becomes the holy grail. Because as a biometric system, if you can acquire someone's iris as they're walking, without them really even being aware of it, without them having to stop, well, you know, you've got the acceptability and collectability problem nailed. It ceases to be low acceptability and becomes high acceptability. And with all the other advantages of the iris in terms of its performance, its uniqueness, its universality, really a system such as irises on the move would really put that right there as literally the top level of biometric that could ever be used, because it's also quick, the performance is fast, the data is rich, it's easy enough to process once you've got that image. So it's the acquisition phase, of somebody moving, which has traditionally been considered a difficult thing to do. We're now seeing systems in reality that can do this. And particularly, we're seeing airports all over Europe which are using irises at a distance. So to summarize, the iris is highly unique, very difficult to circumvent due to that liveness detection and the constant dilation and constriction that you see in the iris because of the light levels. So the contraction furrows and radial furrows will always be deepening and moving, so it's almost impossible to circumvent. It's very unique, it's very rich data. No two irises will be the same, even in twins, because that pattern, once extracted, will contain enough information really to categorically easily identify that person. The pattern around the pupillary zone is best extracted using an infrared imaging camera in order to see the data a little bit more clearly than you would with visible light. But once it's extracted, it can be normalized into a unique two-dimensional iris code. So the normalization process will stretch it into a standardized two-dimensional rectangular image so that everybody's iris has been stretched into this particular shape. So for example, when your iris was taken, whatever stage of dilation it was at, it's normalized to a particular size or stretched out as if it was unfolded. And modern systems, we're seeing iris at a distance and in particular on the move being what's sought after. So hopefully that clarified some points about the iris as a biometric, and thank you for listening.